So first a proclamation and now an act? What are those British up to now? And why should you care? Well, I am so glad you asked. Remember how I mentioned that there was more to come about the 13 colonies and the British? Well, here's the rest of the story. So let's think back and remember the goal of the Royal Proclamation. Do you remember? Do you? Okay, here it is. The goal was to bring more English to Quebec and assimilate the French. Well, let's examine that and see how it worked out. Only a few hundred English-speaking newcomers came to Quebec. Well, there's a big surprise, English not wanting to live with the French. And despite the Royal Proclamation, the French refused to give up their national identity and be made English. The assimilation of the French was a flop, a disaster, an utter failure, a colossal waste of time. Surprise, surprise, right? Plus, the 13 colonies had become restless under British rule. By 1765, the colonies had grown quite prosperous and were starting to question if they needed the British anymore. The only people that were happy were the First Nations. The British, being the smart country that they are, could feel the discontent from the 13 colonies and wondered if they would fight back. So, in anticipation of a rumble with the 13 colonies, the British began to reassess their current situation. If the 13 colonies were to rebel, would the French rebel too? The British realized that they could not make a Frenchman English and needed the French to be happy. So, the British decided to make amends with the French. The best way for the British to win the loyalty of the French was to recognize the rights that had been taken away in the Royal Proclamation, aka bribery. It is like a little kid who says, "I will give you a candy if you will be my friend." Instead of candy, the British gave the French the Quebec Act in 1774. In a nutshell, it took all the land that had been given to the First Nations to the French and gave the French back all the rights that had been taken away in the Royal Proclamation. The Quebec Act expanded Quebec to its original size when it was New France. The French language and rights were now recognized, and the French signal system, the farming method, remained in place. Catholics were given freedom of religion and allowed to hold government jobs. Civil law was used in matters of property, inheritance, and to settle disputes. And lastly, the Roman Catholic Church got back the power to hold property and to tithe, another fancy word for collect money. The Quebec Act was not just a way to make amends with the French. It showed the French that the British recognized French rights to maintain traditions and their language. If you were from Quebec, you may have thought, finally! Okay, so let's be serious for a moment. The Quebec Act planted the seeds of bilingualism. Bilingualism was the foundation for peace and a partnership between the French and the English, and recognized the national identity of two peoples who forged the foundations of Canada. This is pretty heavy stuff. Bilingualism flourished, and today Canada has 2 official languages, and citizens have the right to government services in both languages and to do business in both languages. But what about the First Nations people? The First Nations people, they lose their land that had been promised to them again, without their permission or consultation. Again! The Quebec Act shows the First Nations that they have no control over the decisions that affect them. So finally we get to the rest of the story. So now that the British have patched things up with the French, they must turn their attentions to the 13 colonies. Remember how I mentioned earlier that the colonies had become prosperous by 1765? Well, by 1774, they were even more prosperous and were now really, really frustrated with the British. So why all the frustration? Well, that's an easy answer. The British kept doing things that made the 13 colonies mad. If you asked a colonist how they felt about the British, you might have heard the following comments. For starters, the British have given the Ohio River Valley to the First Nations and told farmers to go to Quebec if they want land. Really? English farmers going to a French community? Yes, right. Or maybe someone may have said, then the British give the land promised to us back to the French in 1774 under the Quebec Act. Wait a minute, something fishy is going on here. Didn't we just fight for the British to take that land away from the French? This is totally unfair. You may also hear a comment like, the 13 colonies are forced to trade with only the British. This is totally frustrating because we have lots to trade and want to open up our markets to others. Remember how to build a strong country? You remember a strong economy. Okay, so that part was Mrs. Carroll talking. Another person may have said, and don't even get me started on the taxes that the colonists are forced to pay. I mean, really, why pay taxes to the home country when we can take care of ourselves? Let us take control of our own affairs. And lastly, you may have heard a comment that went something like this. Well, if that isn't enough, the British steal our men and force them to serve in the British Navy. Finally, the 13 colonies couldn't take it anymore. That's it. We've had enough. The American Revolution! The American Revolution was the first anti-colonial, democratic revolution in history. Americans had insisted on representation, and when the British denied it, they fought their colonizers. Americans won and set up their own government, a republic. In simplest terms, for the first time in history, a colony had beaten a colonial superpower and won their independence. Holy Toledo, Batman! This shocks the socks right off the British. The 13 colonies became the United States of America on July 4th, 1776.